Hi everyone, this is Counseling 4500, Chapter 13, Postmodern Approaches, Part 2. So now let's talk about the second section of this chapter, which is the narrative therapy introduction. So that is individuals construct the meaning of life in interpretive stories, which are then treated as truth. So remember we talked about postmodern, right? So we are now asking this person to tell us how they see the world in a story format. Oftentimes when we talk to other people, we're like, let me just tell you what happened, right? And it's usually in a kind of a narrative format. And so it is so common, and we can see it in, like, let's say a book, right? So we all were born, and that's maybe chapter 1, right? And then we go forward, maybe now we are in our 20s and we're in chapter 5. So they can go all the way up to there, and then we can talk about how they might see the rest of their lives. People are heavily influenced by their culture, which can create a barrier to people. So again, remember we talked about limits. Sometimes we don't understand because of the way that we were raised, that we don't see certain possibilities in our lives or changes, that can be healthier for us. And then will also make us a little bit more happier. All right, key concepts focus on narrative therapy. So encourage to establish a collaborative approach with special interest in listening respectfully to client stories. So just on a side note, you were probably told by some of your friends or family that you would probably be a really good therapist or a psychologist or a human service person, probably because you're a really good listener and they appreciated you, right? So this form definitely does depend on you being a really good active listener. And to do that, you really need to remind yourself to clear out your head and not think about how to respond to your client. Just listen to them, right? Listen to the nuances. Listen to the patterns that you might pick up. Listen to their emotions from their voice and stuff like that. Okay? To search for times in clients' lives when they were resourceful. Use questions as a way to engage clients and facilitate their exploration. To avoid diagnosing and labeling clients, which is again similar to the previous things that we're talking about in this chapter. To assist clients in mapping the influence a problem has had on their lives. So kind of like, try to understand what's going on. Assist clients in separating themselves from the dominant stories that they have internalized so that space can be open for the creation of alternative life stories. So that's really important in narrative therapy here is, they've been telling these stories as though that's the only way it is. But no, it doesn't have to. There's still chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 that are unwritten. And, if it was already going to be all the same, it would have already been written up to like the end of the chapter or the end of the book, right? But it isn't. The truth is that we're only up to here, and we're here for therapy, which means that we want to change and, be happier, hopefully, and make healthier choices. So that means that there are chapters that are still unwritten in the future. The role of stories. We live our lives by stories we tell about ourselves and that others tell about us. Yeah, that's true. Even in an interview, they're like, tell us a little bit about you, right? They want to know what your story is. Shape reality in that they construct and constitute what we see, feel, and do. So now you also want to listen with an open mind, normalizing judgment. Any kind of judgment that locates a person on a normal curve and is used to assess intelligence, mental health, and normal behavior. So you want to just see what's going on with this person. Don't judge them in a way where like, oh, you're terrible or whatever. No, let's normalize it because this is how they have been living so far. The therapeutic process. Collaborate with the client to come up with a mutually acceptable name for the problem. So together, what are you going to call this problem? What is the title of your chapter, right? Personify the problem and attribute oppressive intentions and tactics to it. So let's work on it, right? How do we approach it? Investigate how the problem has been disrupting, dominating, or discouraging to the client. And then invite the client to see his or her or their story from a different perspective by offering alternative meanings for those events. So yeah, when you read a book, every person who reads a book is going to see it a little bit differently, right? So this is what we're going to do. It's like, I've been listening to your story and this is what I noticed about it, right? you're not necessarily like, changing their minds or whatever, but you're like, you know what, I saw this part as you surviving. You did these things because you were trying to make it out of a really overwhelming experience, so that they can also see a different perspective of what they've been doing, or what harms or abuse or sadness that they have been experiencing. All right, discover the moments when the client wasn't dominated or discouraged by the problem by searching for exceptions to the problem. So, again, this kind of is talking about the first half of this chapter so far, right? When were the times where life was good? Find historical evidence to bolster a new view of the client as competent enough to have stood up to, defeated, or escaped from the dominance of oppression of the problem. So, dominance or oppression of the problem. So, here, again, we're talking about is we're listening to your story. And historically, in the past, you were able to do these things, right? Or survive these things, or not necessarily felt overwhelmed. So we're going to remind them that this has happened for in their lives because they told us about that. So that means active listening from therapists to take notes and remember those times when they had strength. Ask the client to speculate about what kind of future could be expected from the strong, competent person who is emerging. As the client becomes free of problem-saturated stories of the past, he or she or they can now envision and plan for a less problematic future. So basically, it's kind of like, what have you learned from the problems, right? We hear oftentimes people say, we sometimes hit a bump in the pavement or on the road, but what did we learn from it? And that's what we're talking about here. Find or create an audience for perceiving and supporting the news story. It is not enough to recite a news story. The client needs to live the news story outside of therapy. So again, we're very process-oriented, active. Because the person's problems initially developed in a social context, it is essential to involve the social environment in supporting the new life story that has emerged in the conversation with the therapist. So what that means is, when the client comes into therapy, it's a safe space, right? So they can explore, they can try all these different things. But when they go back into their lives, that's where all of the things that might challenge them, that the people around who might not support them or whatever, exist, right? So that means that they need to learn how to deal with this problem in this real context that they normally or typically live in, so that we can really make sure. Because in therapy, you can say and become, you can say and become this amazing person, but if you go back home and you cannot actually do any of this with the normal life that you live, then it hasn't been as effective. There's some, progress, but it's not necessarily progress in your real world or your client's real world. Move problem stories towards externalized descriptions of the problem. So kind of depersonalized, like remove it from the client's insights and just put it onto the book and say, this is just one thing. This is not all of you and that's it, right? It's just something that you have experience and we're going to deal with it, and then turn the page. Map the effects of the problem on the individual. So that means talk about how you see the problem affecting them. They're sad, they're not necessarily taking care of themselves, or whatever it is. Listen to signs of strength and competence in the individual's problem-saturated stories. Build a new story of competence and document these achievements. So you might have them do certain types of assignments, and as they achieve those assignments, you want to really take point, or make a point that they realize that they have done these things. Therapy goal is to invite people to describe their experience in new and fresh language. So let's talk about the application, therapeutic techniques, and procedures in narrative therapy. Questions and more questions. So embedded questions are circular or relational, and we'll explain this as we go along. Generate experience rather than gather information. So again, have them do these things that are process-oriented, action-oriented. Progressively discover the client's experience so that the client has a sense of preferred direction. Right. So we want to make sure that they know where they want to go. Allow clients to explore various dimensions of their life situations. So again, reframing potentially, or offering hey, this is how I heard your story, right? How the problem first presented itself and how did they affect the person's life. So talk about those things. Okay, externalization and deconstruction. The person is not the problem is the problem. So that is echoing feminism, right? Where before, let's say a woman was very upset about her life because she felt like a failure. And the reason why is because she's 25 and she's not married with children yet, because that's how her family expected her. So that's not really her. Like, if she did not have those expectations from her family, she would probably be fine, right? And so we need to make sure that society, the context of the problem is the problem itself. It's not you, the client themselves, right? They're dealing with it, right? And we recognize it, and that's true. But we also want to make sure that they realize that, this is sometimes things that are within our culture that the social constructionism that we were talking about before, social constructs, are the reasons why we are feeling this way. So it's okay to feel those ways, but we also know that we can also change those things. The therapist helps deconstruct these problematic stories by disassembling then taken for granted assumptions that are made about the event, which opens up the opportunities for other possibilities. So we're going to basically say, hey, let's see what else we can deal with or do with this situation. So externalization means separates the person from the identification with the problem. So we talked about that. The problem is the problem, not you. Externalizing conversations are counteract oppressive, problem-saturated stories and empower the clients to feel competent to handle the problems that they face. So we're talking about it, right? Process-oriented. Map the influence of the problem in the person's life. Map the influence of the person's life back on the problem. All right, let's search for some unique outcomes. Talk to the client about moments of success, about the problem. Was there ever a time in which anger wanted to take over and you resisted? How did you do it? So again, have them talk those things out. Very similar to the first half of this chapter. Highlighting moments when the problem did not exist or dealt with successfully, creating a counter story. Counter story basically means like an opposite version. Like, on one hand, this is what happened, but on the other hand, you also can do this, or you did this, or you chose to do this instead this time. And it seemed like it worked really well, right? So the counter story. All right. Circulation questions is, now that you have reached this point in life, who else should know about it? Remember, in feminist therapy, part of it is you work on yourself, but you also work on helping change society's expectations of these things so that other people don't go through the same thing. So here, what that is asking is, now that you are successful or working on towards becoming successful, what are some of the things that you would want other people to know about? What have you learned? Right? I guess there are a number of people who have outdated views of who you are as a person. What ideas do you have about updating these views? So some people might assume certain things about you. So now that you're working on it, what should people be aware of? What should people know? And if other people seek therapy for the same reasons you did, can I share with them any of the important discoveries that you have made? Again, inviting to let them know that they are actually participating in changing society one person at a time. Alternative stories and reauthoring. Constructing new stories goes hand in hand with deconstruction. So you're going to break down the problem, and then now we're going to start anew, let's say. All right, people continuing to actively reauthor their lives. So like we said before, maybe their life so far is from chapter 1 to 5, and then therapy is chapter 6 and 7. What is going to happen in chapter 8, right? How are they now going to build upon what they've learned and then now change their lives for a healthier, happier version of themselves? Have you ever been able to escape the influence of the problem? The therapist listens for clues of competence in the midst of a problematic story and build a story of competence around that. So again, hear about it and then echo it to them. Let them hear that you hear what they are saying. Okay, the turning point. So that means basically kind of like that aha moment, or what was the phrase that we used before? Oh no, I just forgot it for a quick second. It's a Greek word. Okay, it's cathartic. I just remembered. So it's a cathartic moment. So the turning point is when a client decides to make a choice of whether to continue to live by a problem-saturated story or create an alternative story. So what that means is the client is now realizing they can live the life the way that they have always been living it and maybe be unhappy, or they can now actually change it and then live a different life. Documenting the evidence. New stories take hold only when there is an audience to appreciate and support them. So it's kind of like, a movie. If a movie is made and it's just sitting, on a shelf where no one's watching it, no one's learning or getting anything from it, right? So we're going to now react to it. Right, writing letters is one way. Record the session and may include an externalizing description of the problem and its influence on the client. So you can share that. List the client's strengths and abilities that were identified in that session. So write about what you heard, right? What you recognize are considered like strengths. And please remember to be genuine and honest. Don't lie. Read at different points in the therapy, so remind them every once in a while throughout the entire therapy that you're doing with them. Highlight the struggles that the client has had with the problem and draw distinctions between the problem-saturated story and the developing new and preferred story, right? Again, so we're talking about reminding them that you saw how you were always typically behaving before therapy, and now what you see is a little bit different, what you've learned in therapy and actually worked on. Stories can be long or short. Encourage the clients. So whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It really does depend on the problem that they come with. All right. The introductory paragraph reconnects the client to the previous therapy session. So again, we're going to summarize and kind of bring back like, oh, this is what we talked about last time, or this is what I heard about your story last time. Statement summarize the influence of the problem has had and is having on the client. So remind them that's what happened. And then question the therapist's thoughts about after the session that pertain to an alternative story that is developing may be posed to the client. So what that is saying is, you can say, when we were talking and you had brought these things up, it made me think after our session, what can you do to continue this? Because I think I see some changes in you, right? So kind of like questioning and encouraging them to continue all this stuff by saying that you notice something. The letter documents unique outcomes to exceptions to the problematic story that has emerged during the session. Quote the client verbatim when possible. So what that is saying is, when you're taking notes, and most therapists do take notes, whenever there's something that's like a really powerful statement, like your client might say something like, "I'm the happiest I am now." That's really powerful. So you need to quote them verbatim and say, you even said that you are the happiest you have been ever, right? And that's so amazing. And again, these things that we're talking about here are things that you might want to bring up every once in a while as you go into therapy. You don't have to do this every therapeutic session, right? This is something like you want to let them know, like, oh, I just want to remind you that these are things that I thought about when we were working together or as we're working together. Some therapists say that a well-written letter can equate to 3 to 5 sessions. That's amazing, right? So again, every once in a while, you want to let them know, hey, I noticed that, you've been doing really well. And these are the ways that I've noticed that you've done this. So, hopefully that will encourage them and encourage them to basically continue doing healthier things for them. All right, postmodern approaches from a multicultural perspective. Strengths. Clients sometimes feel the expectation that they should conform their lives to the truths and realities of the dominant society. Yeah, each culture has their value system, and so we all kind of want to try to live that good moral life, right? But the thing is, we all live it very differently. No one has that perfect life. So we need to understand that this is what's going on, but it's not necessarily something that anyone can ever strive for that final self-actualization. So multiple realities means that their story is valid. So again, because they're not necessarily living these lives that society is expecting, it's okay. It's valid still because they were raised in a certain way or they were brought up in a certain situation, and this is just how it is. Multiple realities mean that their story is valid. Encouraged to explore the realities that are constructed out of their cultural discourse. So again, we talk about the fact that we are trying to live our lives, right? Narrative is anti-individualistic. So in this sense, what that is saying is, remember we talk about individualistic versus collectivist, right? So individualistic is kind of like being competitive, trying to win, be the best, right? But here's the reality. The reality in this postmodern world, or this discourse that's postmodern, is that we all live very different lives. And even though we're all trying to achieve certain types of goals, we all do it differently. And it's okay, right? It's not about who's going to be better or who's going to win this game, because most of us are not winning anything. We're just trying to live our lives and be happy, and that's good enough. All right. When people are able to come to understand how oppressive social practices have affected them, it can lead to a new perspective on dominant themes of oppression and new stories that can be generated. So, what that is talking about is very echoing the feminism part is that, the way that life is or society is sometimes is not so great. Okay. And let's talk about the fact that sometimes life isn't so great or the opportunities are not there or whatever it is, but it doesn't mean that we have to then just give up. No, we can actually be or try to do some of those changes that we believe in or we see. Tell me more about the influence that your culture has played in your life. That's a great question to ask. What can you share with me about your background that will enable me to more fully understand you? What challenges have you faced growing up in your culture? What, if anything, about your background has been difficult for you? And how have you been able to draw on strengths and resources from your culture? So, when it comes to multiculturalism, we really want to respect that, right? We want to understand. So, if you are someone of a different culture, maybe even in the same culture, you can ask these questions because we don't want to say, this is how I see the world and this is how you should see the world as well. No, we want to value the individual person and how they see the world because of their context, their situation that they're living in. All right, shortcomings is not knowing the stance can make the clients feel as though the therapist does not know what he or she or they are doing. Remember, we came from that not knowing stance, or we're curious about them. It's not that we don't know anything about therapy. It's about the fact that therapy is very individualized. So we may not know you very well yet, but as we hear you talk and share your story, we are going to learn. And for some people, they're like, how come that person doesn't know anything about me? I thought you were supposed to help me. But no, you really do. And usually they understand that. But this is a critique when it comes to this specific therapy. All right, we're done with this chapter. Thank you. Bye.